Jennifer, thanks so much for joining me today. I appreciate your being on the Mark Divine Show.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. It'll be a great conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I mean, it's such an important topic. But one thing I'd really like to do is get a sense. You're up in Canada. You're Canadian by birth. Okay, so
I
give us
am. Yep.
give us a
Yep.
sense of your your formative influences and childhood, parents, education. What led you down this road to be a psychologist, to be studying things like burnout? It's unique. It's a unique path.
It is, and it is pretty circuitous, I think. I mean, I started really wanted to be a writer and studied journalism, and
Hmm.
then ended up loving the behavioral sciences piece. And I
Hmm.
think the storytelling factor played a big role. And I was young. I was always writing, always reading. I was at grade 4. I said that I was going to be a Newbery Prize winner. I decided when I was 9, which is an actually award for children's books, literature, and it was a big literary award. And I decided, and I even put it in one of those time capsules in
Right.
our, front yard of our schools. It's kind of a decision very early on that that's what I wanted to do, which is interesting because
Did
my
it
path
ever
didn't
come to
always.
pass, or is it still a goal? That's fun.
No, well, I've never won a Newbery Award. No, I haven't written children's book, but I'm on my third published book, which is
Hmm.
great. So I've become an author, but not what I expected to be writing nonfiction leadership books around, burnout and happiness and well being. But my mom was a nurse practitioner, a very kind of healing person. She was the first nurse practitioner in Canada, actually, like in the history books, really fought to get rights to be able to practice this type of medicine. And it was her, I think, that really did drive this kind of entrepreneurial spirit and thinking about having no boundaries,
Hmm.
and that I had a voice. I wasn't an imposter. And you go through that a lot, I think, in this world of writing books on this topic without a PhD.
Hmm.
But the probably 20,000 hours I've spent in research focused on this topic is, I think, made it so that I can talk, as an expert to it, but I think I talk to it passionately because my own experience going through
Hmm.
burnout and really understanding what it's like to play, this juggling role of mother,
Hmm.
of advocate, of female co-founder in a
Hmm.
highly male dominated world. All of those things really played into my own burnout cycle, and it made me want to be able to write this book.
Hmm. So before we get into the topic of burnout and our implications for our culture today, let's talk about your early career and maybe your experiences with that, with burnout, and what it was like, what your experience was, how it affected you and your family, all that. So let's make it personal first before we make it
Yeah,
broad.
and it really is burnout. And ironically too, I'm writing this book in the middle of a pandemic, which with
Right.
3 kids, there was a lot of, constant irony as the burnout expert feeling
I could
extraordinarily
see
burned
that.
out.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it started really early on for me. It's interesting because I was in Silicon Valley in those early days of social media, and people were kind of saying it was going to be nothing, like, and trying to advocate to people that really didn't want to listen, that
Hmm.
we needed to get our team on Twitter, and we needed to
Hmm.
engage in LinkedIn and some of these other components. I remember these executives saying, like, no one's going to take this seriously. This is the stupidest thing ever. Like, can you imagine a president tweeting? And I said, well,
Right. That's hilarious.
and I think, oh, I wish maybe we could backtrack at this point now. Maybe I wouldn't have been such an advocate. But I think I've always been really connected to things that people don't think are really going to happen or important, or I don't know, maybe I like to be an underdog. But then I got into this concept of well-being and happiness, and how, maybe we can actually focus on being happy at work, that we don't all have to be disengaged and
Hmm.
depressed and kind of be weekend warriors.
Hmm.
And I've been working in sort of HR services and communications, and then realized I think we should research this. There was this precipitating moment in my life where my husband, who's a pro athlete, played pro in 2 different sports, actually, represented Canada in 4 different international, medals. He got very sick. He ended up becoming
Mhm.
acutely paralyzed from
Oh,
Guillain-Barré
wow.
syndrome and had West Nile and had contracted, swine flu twice, just completely debilitated his whole body, and everything changed in a moment for both of
Mhm.
us, his
Mhm.
identity. And we were living in California at the time. And this sort of shocking awareness that, everything can change in a moment, and you're
Mhm.
still forced to go to work, and you're still expected to be competitive and high
Mhm.
performing and still work at those same hours. And
Mhm.
there's very limited grief policies, and care policies weren't even
Mhm.
in existence at the
Right.
time. And there just weren't a lot of protections. And we sort of had this moment where it was like the things we were talking about were being realized.
Mhm.
And that kind of brought us back to Canada, because we were living in California then, and brought us back to
Mhm.
Canada and reset our priorities, and started up our company, which was a sort of a focus on well-being, and taking
Mhm.
that thinking into the workplace. But as a female co-founder and a married co-founder, it was
Mhm.
really a challenge to find funding. And again, we're in
Mhm.
this uphill battle. And that was a moment where I thought, no matter how committed you are sometimes to a purpose or a meaning or a goal, and you feel really good about it, you're going to constantly face these challenges. So, how do you
Okay.
develop the psychological fitness, the social emotional flexibility, the
Mhm.
emotional intelligence to really get
Mhm.
over it? And it took me going through burnout, took me through going through these life challenges before I figured out, I think, a path to being able to do this in a way that's sustainable and healthy.
Right. So you mentioned, your husband manifested his burnout, obviously physically through decreased immune system, autoimmune issues, disease, breakdown physiologically. How did you manifest your burnout? Because it shows up in many different ways, as you know. And I'm just curious, like
Yeah.
from your perspective, and then how else would others recognize burnout if they're not familiar or if they're in denial about it?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of entrepreneurs and people, in this role, especially in a startup role, but even a stay up, or anyone that's a leader of their own kind of their own goals,
Hmm.
they're not very good at being their own boss. They're not
Hmm.
great at saying, okay, you need to take a break, or
Hmm.
you're not good at telling yourself, okay, you're overworking. You feel strongly committed to the mission. You feel
Hmm.
almost married to it. Failure becomes not an option. You also are passionate about it. You love the work, and this whole idea that, you love what you do, you never work a day in your life, is just such a
Hmm.
total myth. And you actually work really hard, and people at most risk of burnout tend to be really passionate about the stakeholder or their
Hmm.
job or their work. And I also felt like I was in this unique role. There was only 7% of females that get funded
Hmm.
in tech in their
Hmm.
companies that they're co-leading or leading. And so I felt this responsibility to then advocate, and be in on boards and be talking about this role that
Hmm.
women have to play. And I ended up taking on sort of that responsibility, which meant I left very little room for
Right.
myself and
Right.
self-care. And I don't believe that burnout is solved with self-care alone. But
Hmm.
when you are your own boss, you do have to model the behavior to the people around you of self-care, or else no one really follows suit. So
Right.
you start to churn up a whole culture of burnout. And that's sort of what we created. And I'm running this happiness technology company, a company that's trying to solve workplace stress and increase well-being at work. And I was just this walking contradiction. And I hated that. I
Yeah.
felt really, upset with
Almost like a
myself. It's
fraud. Yeah. Or yeah, I can imagine how
Yeah,
that would be interesting.
I felt like a fraud. You're right. I
Yeah.
felt like, okay, how am I the expert when I'm not following any of my own
Right.
rules? And so I ended up having a break physically, emotionally. I was completely exhausted. I was emotionally distanced. I didn't want to connect with the goal anymore. I didn't care about it. I stopped caring about, being happy. I didn't care about the things that made me happy about the work.
Hmm.
The things that I used to love, I stopped loving.
Hmm.
And the depletion, really the exhaustion, was a big part. So I just had to leave, leave the
Hmm.
thing that I had built and take a 6-month break and
Hmm.
really figure out what I was going to do. And it came with, financial stress and emotional
Hmm. Sure.
stress and relationship stress. So, there's consequences, and they can be catastrophic for people. And we kind of
Yeah.
downplay burnout. But I know for myself, after going through that and realizing how much risk, I'd put to my life and my family, that, I didn't want other people to have
Right.
to have it be too late before they made a change.
Right. That's so fascinating. There's so much to unpack there. First, like burnout came in waves, right? And I think that's really interesting, right, perspective, because you guys had a burnout moment in California. So you go back to your smaller town in Canada, closer to family, and you think, well, that's changing location, changing setting is going to solve all my problems. It can help, right? But it's not the be all end all. So then you start your business. Now that begins a second phase where you're leading up to disaster, because the pressure and the stress you take on as a founder, startup founder, and I've been there several times myself, where you are responsible, right, for capitalizing the business, for the employees, for the client work, for your own financial well-being. And all of a sudden, when people have a job, they're responsible for their productivity, basically for their output. But when you run a business, you're responsible for about 10 other things that are suddenly the weight, and it sounds great, right? The freedom of owning your own business and the potential for a higher financial return sounds great, but it comes with a very high tax, and that tax leads a lot of business owners into burnout, and they're unaware of it, or they're not acknowledging that when they go into it, right? So they don't know how to structure their time, they don't know how to structure their relationships, they don't know how to set proper boundaries. All of these things start to poke their head into the game and contribute to
Yeah,
that
you really
situation.
do see that with entrepreneurs
Mm-hmm.
very distinctly, actually. And I learned a lot. I took a lot away from that first experience of, and just understanding, what is sustainable growth for me. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
expectation of growth when you're in a kind of a tech community, and this
Mm-hmm.
idea of investors, and even just how I'd fund my business, how I
Mm-hmm.
funded, going into this next phase of where I'm evolving, and realizing that when you have external pressures, it changes what you need to be able to produce. And really going through, this trial by fire has been considerably helpful, in my later experience, because I realized, okay, what really matters. I started to come up with this schematic of, prioritization, and it was deathbed regrets. Like it's such a morbid way of thinking about it, but I started thinking, okay, this
Mm-hmm.
decision to take on this project, even though it sounds fun and I'm so excited by it, and this sounds great, and this could offer this much, increase in
Mm-hmm.
capital here. I started to go, okay, well, how much will that take me away from my
Mm-hmm.
family? How much of a learning curve is this? Do I want to be learning right now, or do I want to
Mm-hmm.
have mastery? Because right now, mastery is actually quite efficient, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
learning is exciting, but how much is reasonable? What is it, vertical, the learning
Mm-hmm.
curve, or
Right.
could I easily move over into this space and it not be too challenging?
Mm-hmm.
How much, how many meals am I going to miss with my family? How much travel am I going to do? And so I think about what that would mean, and would it be a deathbed regret if I said no? And
Mm-hmm.
many times it isn't. And you say no and you feel like, oh, that opportunity's gone, or I missed it. But then, the FOMO goes away, and then you get back to what, the joys of being able to participate in your life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's
That's
been a
great.
real, growth moment for me.
Definitely. And one of the, I want to kind of highlight this point because it's so important. We're not really taught to say no in our culture. And, the way I look at it, at the other side of every yes is a large, long series of commitments and obligations and stress. On the
Mhm.
other side of every no is a release of pressure and an opportunity for a better yes. And so, one of the most important qualities to develop as a leader is knowing when to say no, to leave space for the yes, for the better yes, which is kind of what you're saying. But we're not taught that, and there's a lot of pressure to say yes, especially early on in a startup or for a lot of leaders, because we want to please, we want to do the right thing, we want to make money, we want to please our investors. So it's very challenging to develop that no muscle, isn't it?
It is. And, I've been following again, another one of my favorite quotes is you can have anything, not everything. And I,
Right.
and I think that,
Love that.
like we have, it's always about a choice. And, I was trying to teach my daughter that the other day because she was wanting to either stay at the cottage or go to a birthday party. And it was like, she said, I wish I had this really delicious apple and it was so great, and then now you've offered me an orange and I like the orange just as much. And I wish you hadn't even ever offered me the orange. And she's 9. She's being very philosophical about this. And I said, well, that's life, is a lot of, choosing between 2 great things or 10 great things, or,
Hmm.
even 5 bad things. I mean, like, and you choosing the lesser of all evils. I mean, this is life. It's a series of making difficult choices. And for her, it's between the birthday party or the cottage. And for us, it's, major life decisions. But, you just start to understand that there's lots of pathways that we can take, and really knowing, I think, who you are, and probably why I like the age I'm at and where I'm at in my career, is that I have a better sense of who that is. And I
Hmm.
do have the privilege of being able to make those choices. One of the things that causes a lot of burnout for young professionals and for, the BIPOC community and people that are maybe at risk is that they don't feel that they have the privilege of saying no, or that they
Hmm.
can make those choices, that it's impossible for them to turn down that work because they'll get fired. I mean, that's the
Hmm.
the real issue, is that we get to a place, and there's some of us that have those choices and can make those choices, but there's a lot of people in the workforce that
Right.
don't even have that kind of power and privilege to
Do you,
make those
do you think it's a
decisions.
generational thing, Jennifer? Because it seems like Gen X and people entering the workforce now have a lot easier time saying no, or I'm not. That's not for me, or this whole great resignation. A lot of it's coming from the younger generation. Basically finding it much easier to say no to a workplace that's toxic, or to a job that doesn't meet their vision or mission, or it doesn't have an impact mission, and those things.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's an empowerment right now with our younger workforce, and they're saying, I
Hmm.
don't want that carrot that badly. Like
Hmm.
what you
Right.
have defined as a track for success for me, or what
Hmm.
you're defining as my future, isn't the future I want. And so I don't necessarily need to make these choices to give up all these other important parts of my life for it. It's like we're learning now, after however many years, into a place where we might have a little bit more tenure and ability to have those choices. They're saying, I'm not even going to follow that path for 20 years until I can have those choices. I'm going to choose now to
Hmm.
figure out what other job I can do. There's, freelancing, there's
Hmm.
there's gig economy, there's a bunch of different jobs that you can put
Yeah.
together so that you have freedom. You have a lot of benefit from the great
Hmm.
resignation, in that there's high rates of employment out there. There's lots of
Hmm.
opportunities for you to move. And so I think a bit of a revolution is happening right now with our younger workforce, and they're just saying,
Yeah.
well, you better figure out what is the future that I want, because I'm not going to give you
Right.
what you want for me to get there.
That's right. It's neat, and it's also, I mean, it's largely made possible because of this changing nature of work, and so much of the economy now is part-time gig, freelance, all that type of thing. Driving Ubers while you're starting a. There's so many opportunities that just didn't exist. For me at least, and I'm imagining for you and your younger years. So it's neat to see that, and also so that has helped shape their attitude about what's possible, and then also culturally, there's a lot of change. I noticed that your first book you titled "Unlocking Happiness at Work," and now your latest book is "The Burnout Epidemic." It almost seems like they're two different polarities of the same issue, or is the
Yeah.
burnout kind of the sequel to happiness, just looking at it from the other side?
Yeah, it's funny because I have joked that I was, in my tagline, happiness expert, and now I'm the
Right?
unhappiness expert.
Right,
It's sort of
suddenly you're not so
depressing.
happy.
The evolution of my career is sort of sad
That's kinda
and
like life
disappointing.
itself, you go through these waves, right? So
That's exactly it. And you know what? You're most unhappy in your 40s, I guess. It's the least in the curve. It's like the lowest part of your joy, and like 70 is when you're your happiest of all
right,
time. So we're all in an upswing, which is good, I guess. But
got that to look forward
I
to.
yeah, we're all well, at least there's something to look forward to in your 70s. You're the happiest you've ever been.
Right.
But no, it's funny because it's sort of yeah, it is basically looking at it, in just two sides of the equation. But what unlocking happiness at work was, and I sort of say it's like a bit of a naivete in this, like looking at it and thinking, okay, we can just start at this place of optimization.
Mhm,
And that's where I think of a lot of people in happiness really were looking in that social emotional intelligence, that resiliency place,
mhm,
the
right,
gratitude place, and psychological fitness, which we should
mhm,
all be practicing as
mhm,
part of who we are. Self-care is important.
mhm,
It's part of what increases lifespan and healthiness, and that's in our personal lives. But it is a realization, it was for me through those, years of working with organizations, that it ended up making people feel like leadership was tone deaf, or that there was this toxic positivity that was
yeah,
being
mhm,
expected of their staff, and saying,
mhm,
okay, and ignoring the root causes of stress, which is chronic
mhm,
stress, which is and burnout, which are out of their control. And
mhm,
it was really in 2019 when the World Health Organization identified burnout as institutional or occupational stress left unmanaged, that it's a workplace phenomena that really did click for me. And I've been writing about stress and burnout and how it impacts well-being and happiness inside of workplaces for a while, but this announcement was made to get people to think seriously about it,
mhm,
and
mhm,
understand that happiness is a continuum. It's part of what we should be experiencing. It's not a state of being, and that we can only help our employees to be motivated if we're, helping them to be well in the first place.
mhm,
And we've been sort of throwing ice cream to people that need water, and that is where we've really gone wrong. And so a lot of my focus is, okay, yeah, I want you to get to the point where all of those awesome things, those perks, those, the subsidized gym memberships, the chef on site, the more yoga and breathing and calm apps and all those things are actually going to work for you, because you are in a place that has time and energy and wellness and healthiness enough to
mhm,
support actually engaging in those tools. And that
mhm,
became, okay, I just started, this book is just more further upstream on the continuum of how we
mhm,
actually improve well-being and healthiness for our workforce.
mhm. Yeah, and I can see, a very integral approach is necessary, because like you said, you have to solve this at the personal psycho emotional level, but you also have to solve it at the family kind of structural health level, in terms of um, routines around sleep and nutrition and exercise. So that's the external of the eye, or and then you have to solve it at the team level and to solve it at the organizational structural level. And if you leave any one of those unaddressed, right, then you're going to leave some underlying trigger for burnout to remain. So how do you look at it in terms of I mean, maybe you don't provide it, maybe it's more awareness, but do you provide kind of a prescription in terms of some places to start? Because there's a little bit of a chicken and egg, right? If you just do you solve the psycho emotional first and then look at the structural, or do you have to do them all together, or how do you look at this?
Well, and a lot of what I think first has been provocative is I've been pushing back on accountability at the leadership level and the organizational level to fix those root causes But simultaneously, I mean, we can't have learned helplessness. We
Yes.
have to, as individuals, be able to still show up. And there's certain personalities that are very high risk for burnout, like those that are
Mhm.
perfectionists, or
Mhm.
those that have trait neuroticism, or those
Mhm.
that are in, high performing, high competitive, high production focused roles.
Mhm.
Medicine too, doctors tend to have
Mhm.
that mix of different personality traits that puts them at risk of burnout. So a lot of it is still, is and it's not on the individual to solve, but they play a role. I mean, everyone plays a role, but we have to do, if we're doing the work, the last thing that we can have is going into, the coal mine essentially, and getting
Mhm.
sick and coming out, and then we're being told, okay, we're not a warning signal, we're just to be sent back in and continue to be sick. And so
Right.
our employers need to say that, okay, I'm not going to necessarily be responsible for your life satisfaction and your happiness, but I'm responsible for not detracting from it.
Mhm.
And so I have to make sure that there's supports in place so that if you are practicing psychological fitness, emotional intelligence, that you're coming to work with self-care routines and modeling
Mhm.
self-care, then I'm not going to just say, okay, well, it's on you to solve your burnout after I give
Mhm.
you 80-hour work weeks or
Mhm.
unsustainable workloads, or if you're coming into discriminatory practices, or
Mhm.
an exclusive environment that doesn't promote you because of the color of your skin, or
Mhm.
or you're lonely, we've isolated you
Mhm.
and you have no connections, you've been bullied at work. I mean, all of
Mhm.
these things
Mhm.
play into why someone's burning out. And so just the way we've tackled it so far is just saying, okay, well, here, listen to this rain for 15 seconds on an app. And that here, this is the silver
Mhm.
bullet technology that we're going to solve for, you not even being able to go to the bathroom because you have to work, 15
Mhm.
hours today without a break. So
Mhm.
these are the things that we need to juxtapose and remedy, so that everyone's kind of in the same mindset around making work a healthy place.
Right. Yeah, in the realm of behavior science and within an organization, we're talking about culture. And it sounds to me like I'm thinking as you're talking, the structural stuff, such as paid leave, paid time off, having a yoga studio at the office, those types of things, those are fairly easy to implement, relatively speaking. And companies that do a good job, and I would just say this, if companies did a good job with that, then it wouldn't need to be regulated, but they haven't. And so now you have a lot of regulation coming in. Still, those don't solve the problem if there's major cultural issues, right? Because you could have all that stuff and still have a culture that's toxic, still have a culture that rewards, hyper, work ethic or whatever you want to call the hyper achievers who, get rewarded for working 80 hours a week. Well, if you don't, then you're not rewarded. And so that creates a lot of stress for someone who thinks that's not healthy for them. So I guess the question then for leaders is how do we go about changing a culture? Because that's extremely challenging, as you know, because that's your work. It sounds
It
like.
is. You're right. I mean, it's extremely difficult, and as long as it's taken for burnout to get to a boiling point is probably as long as it's going to take to point to take it even
Mhm.
down to neutral. And we've
Right.
really this has been a mostly transactional relationship that we've had with work, and
Right. Right.
where employees have had no rights to a few rights to to
Right.
increasingly, accessing rights. And
Right.
we've mostly only had physical protections and policies. And now
Mhm.
we're finally getting to psychosocial policies, but
Mhm.
there's not even a standard in the US. In most countries, there's only a few. Australia and Canada have sort of psychosocial standards, but that's very new.
What do
So
they
we're
look like, by the way? That's a new term to me.
yeah, I mean,
Psychosocial standards.
for example, when it comes to exclusion, discriminatory behavior, those
Hmm.
types of things, yes, we get that. But it's around
Hmm.
policies, like similar, like we'd have how do you climb a ladder properly, or what boots to wear on the factory floor. You have,
Hmm.
okay, this is how you manage, harassment,
Hmm.
physical harassment, sexual harassment, and then which is a kind of the maybe the the first psychosocial policy to
Mhm.
really come into place. We've seen that in the
Mhm.
last decade or so,
Mhm.
where we're actually getting training and there's policies and expectation. But even newer ones are like right to disconnect policies. There's laws now in several countries. There's a law now in Canada that just got instituted where you can't expect an employee to work outside of their working hours. You can't digitally, like you can't email them, you can't
Wow.
call them, you can't expect them to take meetings after certain hours. And so this right to
Interesting.
disconnect policy is saying, okay, we have created this standard around what
Mhm.
is considered normal working hours. And if you go over that or off of that, then you could be sued. And this is the
Wow.
actual
Interesting.
government policy. Yeah. And so that I'm,
I've gotta change my behavior. You just you just triggered a thought. It's like, I'm always emailing my team after hours. Now, I don't expect them to respond. I actually expect them to respond, during work hours, but I can see how that would set up an improper expectation on their part. For me, it's just to get a
it
task done and it's on my mind, so get it off my mind. Wow, interesting.
Yeah, it creates invisible pressures, and then
Right,
people that can answer will, and that then you
right.
create exclusive behaviors because there's some. I mean, we saw this disproportionate impact on women who take on just again disproportionately a lot of the caregiver roles. So when they're
Right,
putting kids to bed or their bath time,
right,
if there's an email that goes out from their boss and most of their male counterparts can answer, but they can't, then it creates this
right,
separation where they're not working as hard, and it's all bias and
right,
and
right.
history that we don't even realize is part of our the way that we perceive people. But
Mhm,
that is what kind of psychosocial policies is an example of that. That's what's starting to kind of go. There's lots of European countries. France was the first to start it in 2016, so it's still really new.
mhm.
But over the last 6 years we've started to see more standardization around safety, essentially,
Mhm.
like psychological safety, not
Psychological
just
safety.
physical safety.
Right.
And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And we're going to see more people suing because they burned out, or and that's going to create then more psychosocial
Mhm.
policies and standards to say, okay, well, what do we define as burnout? What do we define as preventing that and the protections around that?
Mhm.
And I see that becoming something that's really interesting in the leadership, organizational,
Mhm.
risk assessment, HR space in the
Mhm.
future of work for sure.
Yeah. The last 2, 3 years have obviously been a big contributor to burnout because there's a lot of social and economic and political stressors that suddenly invaded our both personal and professional lives. And then we thought, okay, when things get back to normal, all that will settle down. But we didn't really return to any old normal. So, what do you see now of the impact of remote work and endless Zoom or Microsoft team meetings and uncertainty? How is that affecting burnout, and what can we do about that, if anything?
It's still exhausting people. We seem to kind of think like, okay, we're getting to a new normal, and
Hmm.
it's not a new normal. I said there's no future of work at this point. It's the metaverse of work or the multiverse of work. Like we're in
Right.
another paradigm. Like this
Right.
is not at all what we would have evolved to just naturally. There was this cataclysmic event that forced, we went from 4% of the entire global workforce, 4% to 35% of the global workforce working remotely within a week, like just
Hmm.
dramatic increase. We've, 10x the amount of adoption of teletherapy and telemedicine. We've
Hmm.
just had these massive rapid shifts in a very short amount of time, which has changed our behaviors. It's
Hmm.
changed our mortality. I mean, we went through periods of time where I say we're in the first sort of level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we
Hmm.
were actually in a state of survival on some days,
Right.
protecting our family, protecting our own health. And when you go through that, your social contract with work changes. It's no longer transactional. It's like, okay, I want something different in this relationship, right?
Hmm.
And I mean, we also increased meetings. I mean, meeting fatigue was always a problem, a massive problem before. Just
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
lack of etiquette and people going over in
Mhm.
meetings and
Mhm.
a person dominating the entire meeting by
Mhm.
speaking, in just themselves. Like lots of issues around that before pandemic. We have
Mhm.
actually increased the number of meetings. This is just Teams meeting data, Microsoft Trends data, by 252% more meetings in the last two
Wow.
years.
Interesting.
Like, and Zoom went from, around 10 million daily active users, and within a month they went to 300 million daily active users.
That's amazing.
So it's a total different shift. And so we haven't really paused and said, okay, is this actually what we want in this metaverse of work or future of work? Do we actually want to be this collaborative? And is it
Mhm.
really actually making us more efficient? Or are we
Mhm.
just working more hours and feeling like we need to be toxically productive? And it's not necessarily increasing shareholder value or
Yeah, yeah,
revenue or well being. And that's something that we need to start thinking about. It's why people are quietly quitting and
right.
why people are resigning. It's because this just isn't sustainable.
I agree. It's interesting, and this is gonna go a little off track, admittedly, but when I pan out, I see it's almost as if decisions are being made for us by some technocratic, overlord or elite that is driving humanity toward this metaverse kind of connected digitally, avatar kind of environment, which is, from our discussion, I don't think you believe that's a healthy thing. And I certainly don't believe that's necessarily a healthy thing or what human beings are needing or wanting, right? Human beings want connection. They crave on being outdoor. They thrive, I should say, being in outdoors environments or hybrid environments and human connection. They need time off. Our native ancestors, quote unquote, worked for 4 hours a day, roughly, but the rest of the time they were doing things like play and learning and, things that were human. And so I think it's time for us as a human community to like really step up and say, wait a minute, we have a voice in this. When I saw Saudi Arabia's crown prince wants to build a 75-mile long city, right? That is two buildings extending across the mountain, and they're going to displace all these native tribes, and people are going to be packed into these two buildings. Like, that is the most dystopian view of the future I have ever seen in my life. Like, how could that be good for us? I don't know. What do you say
I
about
I
that?
love that you're saying this because, these are the things that, I'm ranting about right now
Right.
because
Me too.
we're and it's frustrating because, we're sitting 4 to 7 hours more day and we were sitting already too much.
Right.
We're finding that the data is showing that people are actually increasingly lonely. It's the loneliest they've ever
Yeah.
been right now.
Yeah, they're
And
getting
that
more unhealthy, more lonely, more burnout.
more more burned out
And the
and the
antidote is
connection.
to put them on drugs or antidepressants to keep them more sick, and it traps everybody in this horrible cycle.
It's
Sorry.
this and the
Just
connection
hanging out with your
piece.
stuff.
Well, yeah, and the connection piece is maybe the biggest effect. I think you see this on youth. Obviously, mental health
Right.
issues with youth has just exploded. But also when you look at the data around how people are feeling and sort of leadership challenges for remote work is that, what's happened is that some companies have gone fully remote and they're saying that their biggest challenge is connections and connectedness and the loneliness that their remote workers are feeling
Mhm.
like their careers atrophying, like they don't have any connection to their boss. A lot of young professionals are quitting just because this is where you'd meet like your spouse, or you might meet your best friends in those first few years of working, is
Mhm.
like just
Mhm.
serendipitous moments and
Right.
being together and seeing each
Totally.
other face to face. And there's even just really important data. It's really cool. Dr. Jeremy Bailenson from Stanford Media Lab, he did this kind of research project on Zoom burnout. And he
Mhm.
said that there's 4 reasons why. One of them is that we're constantly staring at ourselves, which is not healthy. He said that, and I was reading some data, and that Botox is actually called this the Zoom boom. The pandemic was the Zoom boom.
Really? That's
There, their sales have gone up 90%, and they're calling it
Holy
the Zoom
cow.
boom because we're constantly critiquing ourselves. Social comparison is not healthy. And
Mhm.
then also he found that we're also not meant to, we're not getting the same interactions. You have to look
Right,
at whites of eyes. You
right.
need to look at each other face to face. But he said the only time in real life that we would be this close to each other in person is if we were mating someone or fighting them. So he says we're actually in this hyper aroused
Right?
subconscious state all day long. So we're like, think about your one-on-ones with your boss or, a
Right.
coworker, and you don't realize that you're actually like feeling triggered by this
Yeah.
communication. And I
Interesting.
thought that was so fascinating. So there's all these reasons why this communication is totally unhealthy,
Right.
and that we're now trying to use it so that we can be more disconnected. And even
Mhm.
just that we haven't stopped and said, do we need to have a full hour on Zoom every time we meet? Does it
Right.
always, because it defaults to an hour, these meetings. And
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
like, or can we invite people to not show up and that's okay? How do we politely
Mhm.
decline a meeting? How do
Mhm.
we start to create space? If you're hosting a meeting, make sure that the people that are supposed to be there are there. And if not, put it on yourself to create a really scheduled agenda so that you can say, hey, Joe from accounting, you can jump on from 12:30 to 12:45, but that's all I need you for. Instead
Mhm.
of just having everyone in a room in the same place at the same time sitting down, why not walk and talk with someone and go for a 15-minute walk? Why not have a stand-up meeting? Why don't
Mhm.
you meet in person? I mean, and having hybrid offices where people can show up when they want isn't healthy
Mhm.
either, because then they go into a ghost town and they're
Right.
back on meetings but just in the office. So
Right.
we
Interesting.
really leaders are really challenged right now with figuring out how to do it better. And
Mhm.
we can do it better. We don't have to just be forced into this equation. We really do have this opportunity to be way
Yeah.
better than we are right now.
Now is not the time to follow the herd because the herd's being
No.
led by someone, and that someone may not have your best interests because they don't know. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but
Right. Yeah.
that's fascinating. We got to wrap this up. I want to be sensitive to your time, but back to your book. Like, what is if someone's listening to this and they're like, God, Jennifer just hit a chord with me. I think I'm burned out. What should they do? What's their next step?
Well, first, really labeling if you're burned out is it's good. It's to look for
Mhm.
those three major signs. So, how depleted am I? Am I exhausted by 2 or 3 in the afternoon and feel like I'm just completely wiped out? Do I feel like in the morning it's hard to motivate? Like we just found out that showers are down by 30% this last year. People aren't, changing clothes or
Really?
showering. Like this is,
Wow.
yeah, and
I
it's a
guess we're
sign
saving
that
water.
there's a benefit to that, and no driving, but people are just working during their commute time. But
Right.
yeah, there's benefits to that. But I think it's what they're trying to correlate it to is that people are probably feeling depressed, and
Right.
depression increases this lack of motivation. And so when you're depressed and anxious, you stop caring about those things and you just want to stay in
Mm.
bed.
Mhm.
Are you feeling like you need stimulants to keep awake in the day, and then sort of downers like alcohol and these other types of things that, are you eating emotionally? Those types of things usually signal, okay, I'm trying to come down, at the
Mhm.
end of the
Mhm.
day.
Mhm.
And do you feel dread on, going into work? Do you feel like you're disengaged from work, like you're emotionally distanced from the goals? And are you using language like a lot of language of permanence, always and never? Like, are you saying, this is always going to be like this? It's never going to change. And I'm always running into the same issue. Or you're using I language, very isolated language, like I can't do anything about this. I never get any help. Or, that kind of language usually signifies that you're feeling sort of hopeless, you're feeling
Mhm.
isolated, you feel like you lack control or agency. So that kind of stuff, thinking about that, and then just like that cynicism piece, that hopelessness piece, all of those things, if you're feeling that and you're feeling it frequently, and frequently means 2 to 3 times a week, then you're probably in a position where you're very close to hitting that wall and you need to talk to someone.
Mhm.
If you feel comfortable talking to your boss, you should, but a lot of people say that they can't. So sometimes it's just going to anonymous sources through your EAP,
Mhm.
teletherapy. Being able to,
Mhm.
talk to someone is good. There's counseling groups. Sometimes organizations have a mental first aid
Hmm.
support group within,
Hmm.
peer group within inside your organization. So
Hmm.
it is about reaching out and understanding that this is a very serious issue. People get very sick, and there's real consequences and catastrophic consequences to being at that point where you hit the wall. We
Right.
can sustain feeling symptoms of burnout for a period of time,
Right.
but there's a point when it adds up,
Then
and
it starts to
that
look like it
means,
did in
you
your
know
husband. Yeah.
it adds up and you hit the wall, and then it can mean PTSD, it can
Hmm.
mean needing pharmacological support, it can
Hmm.
mean therapeutics, it can mean, that can mean a lot of time and healing,
Hmm.
and it
Hmm.
impacts your confidence in your job and your career, all these things. So we need to be better about diagnosing and then asking to get
Right.
external support before it gets too far.
I love that. So self-awareness and then self-advocacy really are the first steps. And then from there you can identify the triggers and causes and start to work on both the psycho-emotional as well as the systemic things that are causing, and try to remove the friction and remove the triggers. And then
Yes.
for leaders, I think the leaders, this is very powerful because awareness of what your organization is doing, or what you or your key leaders are doing that might be leading to burnout. And a lot of that is unconscious. Like you said, it's a bias, right? Because of our male dominated kind of hyper performance oriented culture. So to be aware that that's not healthy, and to work toward bringing more balance, maybe first into your own life, because a lot of CEOs
Yeah.
and leaders, are right there, and they've got maybe some more skills that other people don't have, so they can ward off burnout, but it'll show up, right, in some ways. And a lot of my clients are high performance leaders, and man, they're not sleeping well. Like, we have a major sleep problem in our culture. And then, they overcompensate that with hardcore workouts, which then is pumping more cortisol into their system, which is leading them to not sleeping well. And this is a train wreck waiting to happen for a lot of people, right?
It is, and I love that you said that, because sleep, it plays a huge role. I mean, just,
Right.
sleep deprivation one day and we're already,
Yeah, you're behind the
basically
power
not
curve.
functioning at our same level and
Right.
capacity, from a neuroscience standpoint. But we as leaders think that the idea of a break is non-productive time, that rest isn't productive. We need to start thinking of rest as being part of productivity,
That's right.
like that is
Hmm.
actually
Hmm.
holistically part of it. Leaders too, I mean, here's a couple tips for leaders need to model all of these behaviors. They need to
Hmm.
model turning off, or else the invisible pressure will just exist.
Hmm.
And employees can't be what they can't see. They
Right.
need to see you actually behaving in the way that you want them to behave, and
Right.
how you care for them. You have to care for yourself first, that
Hmm.
mask on yourself first. And then we also, as leaders, have to recognize that we aren't mental health professionals. And I think that's why we kind of move away from those conversations with
Hmm.
our teams, maybe, or we feel nervous about having those conversations because we think, oh, what happens if I met with crisis, or what happens if I can't solve this, and it evolves and I'm in a situation where I can't answer that person's questions, and that's
Hmm.
scary for a lot of leaders. What
Hmm.
leaders need to be able to just vocalize to their team is, I'm not a mental health professional, but
Right.
I'm your mental health conduit. So I
Yeah.
know what is in in your EAP to
Hmm.
give you supports. I know what is maybe a local support for anyone that's
Hmm.
dealing with BIPOC issues or LGBTQ plus,
Hmm.
issues, or whatever it is that they're dealing with. Who knows what that is, but I can help. You're a parent or a single mom. What is your thing that I can help you with? If you're dealing with
Hmm.
financial stress, well, this is a support system we have inside of our EAP. And then take mental health first aid. It's a 6-week course that anybody can take, but leaders should really take it. They can
Hmm.
have the right posture in those conversations. They can
Hmm.
have the right language to use in those conversations. They can de-escalate. They can be the
Hmm.
conduit. So we have a job as leaders to be, to be knowledgeable in the products or the
Hmm.
services that we offer to our shareholders or to our teams, but we should be knowledgeable in the human part of our
That's
relationship
right.
with people. And that means just becoming knowledgeable on the topic of mental health.
I love that. And also, I mean, it's a really important step for leaders today is you don't have all the answers, right?
Mhm.
Perfectionism actually is a very unhealthy thing for your teams, right? So you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to solve the problems. Model the behavior by going and seeking help yourself, get a therapist, right? Take time off. In fact, there's not a lot of there's now a lot of research about you should take time off after every important thing you do, like every
Yeah.
deep work training, every Zoom call. Take a few minutes even to breathe, to
Mhm.
walk around the the office, to get outside, because your brain needs that time to really integrate what you learned. Otherwise, if you just go straight to the next thing, you
Mhm.
lose a lot.
Yeah.
And so there's real, like you said, extraordinary benefits, not just health benefits, but decision making benefits to being able to take time off so that your subconscious can assimilate and then feed back to your conscious mind, the right information, as opposed to you just suppressing that. So
Well, and
so
it
much
it
great
makes
stuff
you
there.
higher performing, and we've looked at
Right.
all the data. You wanna be a high performing person, and
Hmm.
you're doing all these other things to be high performing. And
Hmm.
if you're missing this very significant part that actually is giving your brain the
Hmm.
power to be high performing, you can be as physically high performing as you want, but if you are struggling because of stress, making simple decisions, or you're more volatile and you're not being mindful in the way that you lead, I mean, you're
Hmm.
not actively listening to people, I mean, then you're losing so much of your momentum. And
Hmm.
so high performance needs to be in the rest piece and the modeling of the behavior and self-care all need to be considered as part of the
Yep.
expectations that you place on yourself to be high performing.
That's awesome. Thanks so much. And so the book, The Burnout Epidemic, named 10 best new management books in 2022 by Thinker 50. That's awesome. Shortlisted for the 2021 Outstanding Works of Literature Award. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank
Outstanding
you.
work. What's next
Yes.
for you? Are you going to continue down this vein, or you have some other
There's a
topic?
lot of stuff that I'm working on, but I have signed with Harvard Business Review Press and I'm working on the next book. So
Oh,
I'm
okay.
punished. It's
You punish
like,
yourself, but
what?
hey, it's what you do.
Yeah,
You got to share your
what
gift.
am I thinking? It's kind of like, you as a mom, like, you make a choice, or as a parent, you make a choice to have a child, and in those first, whatever, 6 months of their life, you're like, this was the stupidest decision I ever made. I'm so exhausted. And
Mhm.
then you forget, and a year or two later, you have another. So that's kind of like writing a book. You sort of forget how painful it is
Right.
so that you can, do it again. But yeah, it's passion.
That's awesome. Well, good luck with that. And
Thank you.
we'll share all this information, but where can folks learn more about you, or where would you like them to kind of reach out to you on either social media or a website or that type of thing?
Everything is really on the website, which is jennifer-moss.com. It's
Okay.
very easy to remember.
That's
Yep.
easy. Jennifer Moss. Jennifer, thanks so much. I really appreciate your time today. Wonderful work, and it's very important conversation. So, we'll do our part, and we'll get the word out, and share your messages and your work. And let's talk again when you're done and some of the pain is resided from that next book.
I would love that. It was so great chatting with
Yeah,
you. This is such a great combo. Thank
I
you.
agree. Likewise.